Edward II of England wasn't supposed to be a failure. Born in 1284 as the son of Edward the Feu, the legendary Hammer of the Scots, he inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe in 1307. But within 20 years, this king would lose absolutely everything: his crown, his dignity, his freedom, and finally, his life in one of the most brutal murders ever inflicted on a medieval monarch. Let's be clear about what made Edward the coup so controversial. This wasn't just about being a weak king, though he was certainly that. Edward's reign was defined by his intense emotional attachments to male favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. Whether these relationships were sexual remains debated by historians, but medieval chroniclers used language that strongly suggested physical intimacy. What's undeniable is that Edward lavished these men with lands, titles, and political power that infuriated the English nobility. The breaking point came at Bannockburn in 1314, where Edward's incompetent military leadership led to a catastrophic defeat against the Scots. An English army of perhaps 20,000 men was routed by a Scottish force half its size. It was the most humiliating military disaster in English history up to that point, and it destroyed whatever remained of Edward's credibility as a warrior king. But Edward's biggest mistake was alienating his own wife. Isabella of France, married to Edward in 1308 when she was just 12 years old, spent nearly 2 decades watching her husband shower affection and resources on his male favourites, while largely ignoring her. By 1325, she'd had enough. When Edward sent her to France on a diplomatic mission, Isabella refused to return. Instead, she took a lover, Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army. What happened next shocked everyone. The English people rallied to Isabella's side. Edward's support collapsed almost overnight. His favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, was captured and subjected to one of the most brutal executions in medieval history. He was hanged, drawn and quartered, with his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes. The message was clear. This was punishment not just for treason, but for his relationship with the king. Edward himself fled west into Wales, but there was nowhere left to run. On November 16, 1326, he was captured near Lantrisant. The king who had once commanded armies now found himself a prisoner of his own wife and her lover. But capturing Edward created a problem. Medieval political theory held that kingship was ordained by God. You couldn't simply murder an anointed king without risking divine punishment and political chaos. So, they forced him to abdicate. On January 20th, 1327, in a ceremony at Westminster, Edward II was compelled to renounce his crown in favor of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III. The deposed king was assured he would be treated with dignity and kept in comfortable confinement. It was a lie. Edward was first imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle under the custody of Henry of Lancaster. The conditions there were relatively decent, almost respectful. But Isabella and Mortimer faced a growing problem. As long as Edward lived, he remained a potential rallying point for rebellion. Living deposed kings were dangerous. They had to eliminate him, but they needed it to look like natural causes. That meant moving him somewhere more remote, somewhere they could control the narrative completely. In April 1327, Edward was transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. The official guardians were Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers. What Edward didn't know was that his comfortable imprisonment was about to become a nightmare designed to break him physically and mentally, because Isabella and Mortimer had decided that the former king needed to die, and they wanted him to suffer first. But the methods they would use to achieve his death would be so shocking that the truth would echo through centuries of historical chronicles, creating one of the most disturbing murder stories in medieval history. Berkeley Castle sits in the lush countryside of Gloucestershire, a formidable stone fortress that had stood for centuries. For most prisoners, it would have been an uncomfortable but bearable place of confinement. For Edward II, it became a carefully designed torture chamber, where every aspect of his captivity was calculated to destroy his health without leaving obvious marks of violence. The deposed king arrived at Berkeley in April 1327, and his treatment immediately changed. Gone were the relatively respectful conditions of Kenilworth. Edward was placed in a cell that historical chroniclers describe as being situated directly above a charnel house or open sewer pit. Some sources suggest it was positioned over a repository where animal carcasses were left to rot. The stench would have been overwhelming, the air thick with the gases of decomposition and human waste. This wasn't accidental. Medieval medicine believed that foul air, or miasma, caused disease and death. Isabella and Mortimer's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Expose Edward to conditions so unhealthy that he would sicken and die naturally, eliminating the need for obvious violence. A former king dying of illness in prison would raise far fewer questions than one bearing marks of murder. The conditions were designed for systematic degradation. Edward was denied proper food, given just enough to keep him barely alive. He was exposed to cold and damp, deprived of adequate clothing and bedding. The goal was to weaken his body to the point where disease would finish the job. Historical sources suggest he was also subjected to psychological torture, constantly reminded of his fall from power, mocked by his guards, and kept in a state of fear about what might come next. But here's where Isabella and Mortimer's plan started to fail. Edward II refused to die. Despite the horrific conditions, despite being a man in his early 40s who had lived a life of luxury and wasn't accustomed to hardship, the former king's body proved remarkably resilient. Week after week, month after month, he survived conditions that should have killed him. His constitution, strengthened perhaps by years of physical activities like hunting and riding, kept him clinging to life. Thomas de Berkeley, the nominal guardian, may have been uncomfortable with the situation. Later, when he was tried for Edward's murder, he would claim he had been absent from the castle during the critical period and knew nothing of what happened. Whether this was true or a convenient legal fiction remains debated by historians. What's clear is that Berkeley's co-guardian, John Maltravers, was far more willing to do whatever was necessary. As spring turned to summer in 1327, the pressure on Edward's guardians intensified. Isabella and Mortimer needed him dead. Every day the former king remained alive was another day he could potentially be rescued by loyalists or become a symbol for rebellion against the new regime. The 14-year-old Edward III was officially king, but everyone knew real power rested with his mother and Mortimer. A living former monarch was an intolerable threat to their authority. Historical sources suggest there may have been at least one rescue attempt or plot to free Edward from Berkeley. Whether real or imagined, such threats would have made Isabella and Mortimer even more desperate. The subtle approach, the plan to let disease and deprivation do the work, had failed completely. They needed a more direct solution. But here was their dilemma. They still couldn't simply stab him or strangle him or use any method that would leave obvious marks on his body. The former king's corpse would need to be displayed publicly to prove he was dead and to show that he had died of natural causes. Any visible wounds, any signs of violent death, would expose the murder and potentially spark the very rebellion they feared. So, they needed a method of execution that was brutal enough to guarantee death, but subtle enough to leave no external evidence. And according to the most detailed historical chronicle of what happened next, they found exactly such a method. What they chose was so horrific, so deliberately cruel, that it would shock even by medieval standards. On the night of September 21st, 1327, approximately 5 months after Edward's arrival at Berkeley Castle, his captors decided that patience had run out. What happened in that cell over the next several hours would become one of the most infamous murders in English history, a death so terrible that chronicles would describe it in gruesome detail centuries later, and historians would debate its truth even into modern times. The former King of England was about to experience agony beyond imagination, and his screams would echo far beyond the stone walls of Berkeley Castle. The most detailed account of Edward II's murder comes from Geoffrey Le Baker, a chronicler writing in the 1350s, about 20 to 30 years after the events. While some modern historians question certain details, Le Baker had access to people who were at Berkeley Castle or in the surrounding area during that September night. His chronicle provides the primary source for what has become the accepted narrative of how England's deposed king died. According to Le Baker and other medieval sources, on the night of September 21st, 1327, a group of men entered Edward's cell. The exact number varies in different accounts, but they came prepared with specific tools: a large wooden table, restraints, and most horrifically, a red-hot iron rod or poker, along with what some sources describe as a horn or tube made of animal horn. The method they had chosen was diabolical in its calculated brutality. Edward was forced onto the table, held down by multiple men. The horn or tube was inserted into his rectum, and then the red-hot iron was thrust through the tube deep into his body. The tube served a dual purpose. It prevented external burning that would leave visible marks, and it directed the searing metal deep into his internal organs. The logic behind this horrific method was grimly practical. When Edward's body was eventually displayed, there would be no external wounds, no obvious signs of violence. To any observer, he could have died of natural causes, perhaps a sudden illness or heart failure. The internal damage would be catastrophic and fatal, but invisible to anyone not performing an autopsy, and medieval autopsies were rare, especially for royalty. The agony Edward experienced in those moments is almost impossible to comprehend. Medieval chroniclers report that his screams were so loud they could be heard outside the castle walls. People in the nearby town allegedly heard terrible cries coming from Berkeley Castle that night. Some sources claim local residents knew immediately that something horrific was happening, though they had no way of knowing exactly what or to whom. The former king likely died within hours, possibly sooner, from a combination of shock, internal bleeding, and catastrophic organ damage. The men who killed him then had to wait, ensuring he was truly dead before reporting to their masters. They had one chance to get this right. If Edward somehow survived this attack, the entire conspiracy would be exposed. Historical records show that Thomas de Berkeley was officially absent from the castle that night, a convenient alibi that he would later use in court. John Maltravers was present, but the actual executioners were likely lower-ranking men, possibly professional killers brought in specifically for this task. Medieval courts understood the principle of plausible deniability. The people who gave the orders needed to maintain distance from those who carried them out. By the morning of September 22nd, Edward II was dead. The official announcement came swiftly. Letters were sent to Edward III, to Parliament, and to key nobles across England. The message was simple. The former king had died of natural causes during the night. Some versions claimed he died of a broken heart, grief over his lost kingdom. Others suggested he had fallen ill suddenly. None mentioned murder, but the timing was suspicious. Edward had survived 5 months of deliberate deprivation and unhealthy conditions. He had proven remarkably resilient. And then, suddenly, on one specific night, he conveniently died. Some contemporaries may have suspected foul play, but in the political climate of 1327, questioning the official narrative was dangerous. Isabella and Mortimer controlled the government, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to brutally execute anyone who opposed them. The body was prepared for public viewing, a necessary step to prove Edward was actually dead and to quash any rumors that he had escaped. Medieval embalming techniques involved removing internal organs and filling body cavities with preservatives. This process would have concealed any internal damage from the murder method. When Edward's corpse was displayed weeks later, observers reported it looked peaceful, with no visible signs of violence. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The method chosen to kill Edward wasn't just about avoiding external marks. It carried a specific symbolic message, one that reveals the depth of hatred and contempt his murderers felt for him. Because in medieval culture, the manner of someone's death often carried as much meaning as the fact of their death itself. To understand why Edward II's killers chose this particular method, you need to understand how medieval society viewed homosexuality and sodomy. This context is crucial because the murder method wasn't random. It was deliberate, symbolic, and meant to send a message, even if that message couldn't be spoken aloud. In medieval England, sodomy was considered one of the most serious sins. Under both church law and secular law, it was theoretically a capital offense. The official penalty was burning at the stake. Religious authorities classified it alongside heresy and witchcraft as crimes against God himself. Theological texts of the period described sodomy as an unnatural act that threatened the natural order established by divine will. However, there's an important nuance here. Actual executions of nobles for sodomy were extremely rare in medieval England. Accusations of sodomy were more commonly used as political weapons to destroy someone's reputation than as the basis for criminal prosecution. When powerful men were accused of homosexual acts, it was usually in the context of other charges, particularly treason or heresy. Edward II's relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser the Younger had scandalized the English court and nobility. Medieval chroniclers used carefully coded language, but some were quite explicit. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, a contemporary biography, describes Edward's love for Gaveston using terms typically reserved for romantic relationships. Other sources speak of Edward and his favorites sleeping in the same bed, sharing intimate moments, and displaying physical affection publicly in ways that medieval society considered inappropriate between men. Whether these relationships were actually sexual, we cannot know with absolute certainty. Medieval evidence is frustratingly ambiguous on such matters. But what's undeniable is that Edward's contemporaries believed they were sexual, and that belief shaped how people viewed the king and ultimately how his enemies chose to kill him. The method of murder, driving a red-hot iron through the anus, was a horrific parody of the act of sodomy itself. It was punishment through symbolic violence. In the twisted logic of medieval justice, where execution methods often mirrored the crime, this was the ultimate penalty for a man believed to have committed the ultimate sexual transgression. The murderers were quite literally attacking Edward through what they perceived as the source of his sin. This symbolic violence had historical precedent. When Hugh Despenser the Younger was executed in 1326, just months before Edward's murder, his genitals were cut off and burned in front of him before he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. This too was symbolic. Punishment for his sexual relationship with the king and for his perceived corruption of royal authority. Medieval justice was theatrical, designed to make the punishment fit the crime in ways that spectators would understand. But here's the cruel irony. Edward's murder couldn't be public. The very symbolism that made this method meaningful to his killers had to remain hidden because, officially, Edward died of natural causes. The message was there, embedded in the method, but it could only be understood by those who knew the truth. It was symbolic violence performed in secret, satisfying the murderer's desire for revenge and moral punishment while maintaining the political fiction of a natural death. Geoffrey Le Baker, writing decades later, made the symbolism explicit in his chronicle. He understood exactly why this method was chosen, and he wanted his readers to understand it too. Whether Le Baker was reporting accurate details or elaborating on rumors, his account reveals how medieval people interpreted Edward's death as divine punishment for sexual sin carried out by human hands. Modern historians debate how much of this symbolic interpretation to accept. Some argue that the specific method might have been chosen purely for practical reasons, to avoid external marks, and that any sexual symbolism was added later by chroniclers with their own moral agendas. Others point out that medieval people thought in symbolic terms constantly, especially regarding crime and punishment, and that ignoring this symbolism means missing a crucial layer of meaning. What we can say with confidence is this: whether the murder happened exactly as Le Baker described or not, medieval society believed it did, and they understood the symbolic message. Edward II was perceived as having violated natural law through his relationships with male favorites, and his death was perceived as fitting punishment for those violations. The manner of his murder became inseparable from moral judgments about his life. The political calculation was equally important. Isabella and Mortimer needed Edward dead, but they also needed to destroy his potential as a martyr figure. By ensuring his death carried overtones of sexual deviance and divine punishment, they were attempting to taint his memory, to ensure that sympathy for the murdered king would be limited by moral disgust at his perceived sins. But political calculations in medieval England had a way of coming back to haunt those who made them, and Isabella and Mortimer's triumph would prove remarkably short-lived. Edward II's body remained at Berkeley Castle for nearly 3 months after his death. This delay was unusual and immediately sparked suspicion among those paying attention. Why would it take so long to bury a former king? The official explanation was that arrangements for a proper royal funeral required time, but the truth was more complicated. Isabella and Mortimer needed to carefully manage how Edward's death was presented to the public. When the body was finally moved to Gloucester Cathedral in December 1327, it was displayed publicly for several days before burial. This public viewing served multiple purposes. First, it proved definitively that Edward was dead, crushing any hopes among his remaining supporters that he might have escaped or been secretly moved elsewhere. Second, it allowed observers to see that there were no obvious signs of violence on the corpse. Contemporary accounts of Edward's appearance at the funeral are remarkably consistent. Multiple sources describe his body as appearing peaceful, even well preserved given the months that had passed. His face showed no signs of trauma. There were no visible wounds, no marks of violence that spectators could detect. To all outward appearances, this was a man who had died naturally, perhaps of illness, or simply the stress of his imprisonment and fall from power. But some observers weren't convinced. The sheer length of time between death and burial raised questions. Medieval bodies deteriorated quickly, especially in the warmer months, yet Edward's corpse appeared remarkably intact. The embalming process could explain this, but it also meant that any internal damage would be completely concealed. Those who suspected murder understood that they were looking at a carefully prepared presentation, not necessarily the truth. The funeral itself was elaborate, befitting a king, even a deposed one. Edward was buried in Gloucester Cathedral, not in Westminster Abbey, where most English monarchs were laid to rest. This choice was partly practical. Berkeley Castle was closer to Gloucester than to London, but it also served to distance Edward from the royal succession. He was being honoured as a former king, but not celebrated as part of the continuous line of English monarchy. What happened next was unexpected and politically problematic for Isabella and Mortimer. Edward's tomb began attracting pilgrims. Common people started visiting Gloucester Cathedral to pray at the former king's grave, and some reported miracles. In death, Edward was becoming what Isabella and Mortimer had tried so hard to prevent: a martyr figure, someone seen as having been unjustly persecuted. This cult of Edward II never reached the level of official sainthood, but it was significant enough to worry the government. Popular sympathy for the murdered king suggested that the official narrative of natural death wasn't entirely believed. People whispered about Edward's fate, creating folk stories about his suffering and death that often contained kernels of truth mixed with embellishment and speculation. Meanwhile, cracks were appearing in the conspiracy of silence. The men directly involved in Edward's death were becoming liabilities. John Maltravers, who had been present at Berkeley Castle that September night, left England shortly after Edward's burial. He would spend years in exile on the continent, suggesting he feared prosecution or revenge. Thomas de Berkeley, who had maintained he was absent when the murder occurred, found himself under increasing suspicion despite his alibi. The political situation in England was also shifting dangerously for Isabella and Mortimer. Edward III was growing up, and as he approached adulthood, he began to chafe under his mother's control and Mortimer's dominance. The young king was well aware that his father had been murdered, and he knew who was responsible. In medieval political culture, a son was expected to avenge his father's death. Edward III was preparing to do exactly that. In 1330, 3 years after his father's murder, Edward III made his move. At age 18, he was old enough to assert his authority. In a dramatic nighttime raid at Nottingham Castle, the young king's supporters seized Roger Mortimer. Isabella, who was with Mortimer at the time, allegedly cried out, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." But Edward showed no mercy. Mortimer was charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of Edward II. The trial was brief and its outcome predetermined. On November 29, 1330, Roger Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn, the common execution ground for traitors. He was not given the full punishment of hanging, drawing and quartering that he had inflicted on Hugh Despenser, but his death was public and humiliating. His body was left hanging on the gallows for 2 days before being taken down for burial. During Mortimer's trial, details about Edward II's death emerged publicly for the first time. Witnesses testified about the conditions at Berkeley Castle, about the attempts to kill Edward through deprivation, and about the events of September 21, 1327. This was when the official fiction of natural death finally crumbled. The government itself was now acknowledging that Edward II had been murdered. Thomas de Berkeley was also brought to trial, but his case went differently. He maintained his alibi that he had been absent from the castle during the murder, and crucially, he had not been part of Mortimer's inner circle. The jury acquitted him, accepting his claim of ignorance. Whether this was justice or political convenience, modern historians still debate. Berkeley lived another 3 decades, dying peacefully in 1361. Isabella of France, Edward III's mother, was treated with more mercy than Mortimer. She was placed under comfortable house arrest and stripped of her political power, but she was not tried for her role in her husband's death. Edward III understood the political complications of executing his own mother. Isabella lived until 1358, spending her final decades in retirement, reportedly wearing the hair shirt of a penitent and expressing remorse for her actions. But one question continued to haunt historians and contemporaries alike. Was Edward II really dead? A curious document emerged in 1337, a letter supposedly written by a priest named Manuele Fieschi to Edward III. The letter claimed that Edward II had escaped from Berkeley Castle and was living in exile in Italy. Some modern historians, most notably Ian Mortimer, have taken this letter seriously and argued that Edward might have survived. The majority of historians reject this theory. The letter's authenticity is questionable, and its claims don't align with other evidence. But the very existence of such theories shows how deeply Edward's death disturbed the medieval imagination. The idea that he might have escaped his terrible fate was almost comforting compared to accepting the brutal reality. More than 6 centuries after Edward II's death, historians still debate exactly what happened at Berkeley Castle on that September night. The murder has become one of the most analyzed events in medieval English history, generating countless books, articles, and academic arguments. But beneath the scholarly debates lies a deeper truth about power, sexuality, and violence in the medieval world. Let's be clear about what we know with certainty. Edward II was deposed in January 1327, imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, and officially died there on September 21, 1327. His death was initially presented as natural but was later acknowledged as murder during Roger Mortimer's trial in 1330. The men responsible for guarding him either committed the murder themselves or allowed it to happen. Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer, who controlled the government, bore ultimate responsibility, even if they didn't personally wield the murder weapon. The specific method described by Geoffrey Le Baker, the red-hot iron thrust through the anus, has become the accepted narrative in popular culture and many historical accounts. But we must acknowledge the limitations of our evidence. Le Baker was writing decades after the events, possibly recording rumors and interpretations rather than witnessed facts. No autopsy was performed that we know of. No one at Mortimer's trial described the murder method in detail. The graphic specifics come from chroniclers, not from court testimony or official records. Some modern historians argue that Edward was killed by a simpler method, perhaps suffocation or strangulation, and that the iron poker story was added later as moralistic commentary about his sexual sins. Others point out that Le Baker's account is so specific and so consistent with the political and symbolic logic of medieval punishment that dismissing it entirely seems unwarranted. The truth is, we'll probably never know with absolute certainty exactly how Edward died. But here's what matters more than the specific method. Edward II's death reveals fundamental truths about how medieval society functioned. This was a world where monarchy was theoretically sacred, ordained by God, and protected by divine authority. Yet that same world found ways to murder anointed kings when political necessity demanded it. The contradiction between theory and practice, between religious ideology and brutal pragmatism, defined medieval political culture. Edward's death also reveals the deadly consequences of violating social and sexual norms in medieval society. Whether or not Edward's relationships with Gaveston and Despenser were actually sexual, they were perceived as transgressive, and that perception contributed directly to his downfall and murder. Medieval culture had no concept of sexual orientation as an identity, but it absolutely recognized and punished homosexual acts, especially when those acts threatened political stability or social hierarchy. The symbolic violence of Edward's murder, whether real or legendary, functioned as moral pedagogy. It taught medieval audiences that certain transgressions carried specific punishments. Kings who elevated unworthy favorites, who ignored their queens, who lost wars and bankrupted kingdoms, who violated sexual norms. These kings could lose everything, including their lives. The manner of Edward's death was meant to teach this lesson, even if the full truth could never be publicly acknowledged. Compare Edward's fate to other medieval monarchs with similar reputations. William II of England, William Rufus, who died in 1100, was rumored to be homosexual and died in a suspicious hunting accident that many historians believe was assassination. His death was accepted as accidental, allowing the murderers to escape justice. Richard II, Edward's great-grandson, was deposed in 1399 and died in prison shortly after, officially of starvation, but probably murdered. The pattern repeats. Deposed kings don't survive long, and kings who violate social norms die under suspicious circumstances. Edward II's story also illuminates the precarious position of medieval queens. Isabella of France began as a victim, a child bride married at 12 to a man who showed more affection for his male favorites than for her. She endured years of neglect and humiliation before finally rebelling against her husband. But her rebellion transformed her into a murderer and eventually cost her political power when her own son turned against her. Medieval women who seized power directly, rather than exercising it through male relatives, rarely retained that power for long. The cult that developed around Edward's tomb at Gloucester suggests that ordinary people understood his story differently than the political elite did. To the common folk who came to pray at his grave, Edward was a tragic figure, a king brought down by powerful enemies, a man who suffered unjustly. They may not have approved of his lifestyle or his political failures, but they recognized his humanity and his suffering. The pilgrimage to his tomb was a form of popular resistance to the official narrative, a way of saying that even bad kings didn't deserve what Edward endured. Modern parallels are tempting, but dangerous. We cannot simply project contemporary understanding of sexuality and rights onto medieval people. Edward II lived in a world with completely different assumptions about gender, sexuality, power, and justice. What seems to us like obvious homophobia was to medieval people simply enforcement of natural law as they understood it. What seems like brutal murder was to them potentially justified political necessity combined with moral punishment. Yet certain truths transcend historical periods. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Systems that deny people basic dignity and humanity, that punish people for who they love, that treat human beings as political pawns, these systems inevitably produce terrible cruelty. Edward II's death was a product of such a system, and the specific brutality of his end reflected the specific prejudices and power dynamics of medieval England. The debate over Edward's death will continue. New historical evidence occasionally emerges, and each generation of historians brings new perspectives to old questions. But regardless of the exact method of his murder, the essential truth remains. Edward II of England was violently killed by people who saw him as politically inconvenient and morally transgressive. His death was designed to eliminate a political threat while delivering symbolic punishment for perceived sexual sins. In the end, Edward II's legacy is one of tragedy. A man born to kingship, who lacked the skills and temperament for it. A person whose emotional attachments became political liabilities. A human being who suffered systematic degradation and ultimately brutal murder because he couldn't or wouldn't conform to the expectations placed upon him. Whether his relationships with Gaveston and Despenser were romantic, sexual, or simply intense friendships that threatened the political order, they cost him everything. The death of Edward II was far worse than most people can imagine, not just because of the potential physical agony of his final hours, but because of what his death represents. The complete destruction of a human being by a system that valued political stability and social conformity over individual humanity. That lesson remains relevant centuries after the last screams echoed through Berkeley Castle on that terrible September night in 1327.